Thank you so much, Bob, and a big welcome to all of you. I'm Jody Waterhouse, and I am program manager at the CU Anschutz Multidisciplinary Center on Aging, as well as a Colorado Senior Lobby board member. So thrilled to have so many of you here with us for our inaugural Older Coloradans Week. If you've been with us all week, thank you for hanging in there. We have been treated to some wonderful education strategies for advocacy in a virtual world, our new world, and we'll continue that as we wrap up our week today with some terrific programming. This morning's session, we're going to focus on age discrimination and the older Coloradan workplace. And in a recent AARP report, the number of workers aged 50 and over has increased by 80% over the past 20 years. That is 4 times faster than the overall workforce growth. This trend is even more dramatic for those older Coloradans who are 65 and older, whose numbers have nearly tripled over that same period. As we all live longer and we're much healthier, the desire and need to stay in the workforce certainly is increasing. And according to the Federal Reserve, the average retirement age in 2017 here in the United States was 59.9 years. However, here in Colorado, it's 71.8 years. And that is because it is a wonderful place to live as an older Coloradan. We are healthier and we want to work longer. But sharing these statistics with you, nearly 2/3 of older adults have experienced or seen age discrimination in the workplace, which is a staggering statistic. So just during this morning's discussion, we'll now take a more deep dive into the landscape for older adult employment here in Colorado. We're also going to talk a little bit about recent legislation that is being considered to help eliminate that age discrimination issue. We're going to hear some stories from 2 older adults who have experienced age discrimination in the workforce. And finally, we'll wrap up our session with a call to action. We want to ensure that no older Coloradan is ever faced with age discrimination throughout their career. So it's my pleasure to introduce Janine Vandenberg, who is Director of Changing the Narrative here in Colorado, to walk us through some of the survey statistics that recently that she recently collected through the Changing the Narrative initiative. Janine, take it away. And Janine, you're muted.
Shall we try that again? Okay, so lovely to see so many familiar faces and new faces as well. And those of you who know me know that talking about older Coloradans in the workforce is one of my favorite topics. And it was an honor to be able to, this summer and early fall, conduct a survey and really hear from Coloradans age 50 and over how they were experiencing the workforce, especially kind of during and post-pandemic, what their plans are. So the presentation today will be somewhat based on the survey, but before we get into survey results, I'm going to let a little bit of groundwork. I also want to shout out at the beginning, Joining Vision in Action, which actually conducted the survey and did the analysis, and Karen Brown, who was instrumental in kind of launching this and tying it to the kind of policy changes that we needed. So a little bit first about changing the narrative. So we are an initiative funded by Next 50 Initiative and Rose Community Foundation. And really what we want to do, and it seems like a big goal, but we think it's important, is to end ageism. And we say end ageism together because it really requires all of us, right? There are no heroes that are going to come and say, workplace discrimination is over. It's us, it's those of us on this call, in this session, and others who are working really hard to change perceptions about the older worker. So what we do at Changing the Narrative in the workforce space is we do presentations to employers, to business groups, to HR groups on the benefits of older workers. So we're trying to reframe the older worker, if you will. We kind of research what are best practices that are out there about having intergenerational workplaces and the kind of productivity and profitability it leads to. We conduct original research like the survey we're going to share. And mostly, and what we're most excited about is being able to partner with groups like all of you here to advocate for better public policy. So that's in essence what changing the narrative does. Before we talk about workplace age discrimination, I think it's important for us to have a common understanding of what ageism is. And this is the World Health Organization definition. Basically, it's prejudice. So it could be someone in the workplace saying, you know, I just don't like those older people around here. It kind of reminds me of my mom, right? Prejudice. It can be stereotyping. So stereotypes like, oh, you know, we're not going to invest in workforce programs for older people because they really don't want to learn new things. And then it can be outright discrimination. And outright discrimination sounds like, you know, when someone looks at a high school or college graduation date and makes a decision, we're just not going to interview someone. So those are how ageism kind of plays out in the workplace. I do want to note that ageism can also be directed against younger people. So if someone is running around saying something like entitled millennial, that is ageism. But for the purpose of this presentation and the advocacy work we're doing, we're talking about ageism when it's directed against older workers. So Jody kind of introduced how prevalent ageism is. That stat that she shared, 2/3 of people age 45 and over in the United States have either experienced or witnessed age discrimination in the workplace. The Urban Institute released a really startling study at the end of 2018 that basically said 56% of people across the United States who had entered their 50s with stable employment were pushed out or laid off, and only 10% ever recouped financially. But we also know it's not only about the impact on those of us who are older workers. It also, AARP released a study just before the pandemic showing that workplace age discrimination cost our US economy $850 billion annually. So there is a reason for all of us to come together to end it. The other reason this is important is, and Jody and Bob both introduced this in their comments, you know, the world has changed. This graph is from the US Census Bureau. And on the left-hand side, you see the way the world looked like in 1960. We had a whole lot of younger people, right, tapering up to a very small number of older people. In 2060, the projection is it's going to be column shaped, that we have basically equal age distribution. And so that means workforces and policies have to change as well. Unfortunately, so many of our systems and policies really hark back to a time when average longevity was much less. Jody mentioned, you know, we're living longer and for the most part healthier lives. But I encourage you to look at this timeline. So in 1900, we can see average life expectancy at birth for men 46 years, for women 48. 1935, the year that Social Security Act was passed and retirement age, quote, was set at 65. What do we see? Neither men nor women were expected to live to age 65, right? We know currently life expectancy for men, and again, this is at birth, is age 76, and for women, 81 years. But so many of our policies still go back to those earlier times. So for example, the federal government defines prime working age as ages 25 to 54. And I would encourage you to look at this graph from Colorado's Talent Pipeline report that shows, you know, the percentage of the Colorado labor force age 55 and over within a decade is going to be a quarter. So what sense does it make for government policy to be set on this idea that prime working age is between the ages of 25 and 54? We know that, quote, normal retirement age is considered and often talked about as age 65. But we also know pre-pandemic in Colorado, 1 in 4 Coloradans age 65 and over was in the workforce. And projections both from Gallup polls and Transamerica show those trends are just going to continue, not only in Colorado, but around the country. So what we did at Changing the Narrative is, literally, the minute the shutdown orders started, we started getting calls from people we had met around the state about with stories about older people feeling that they were being pushed out because of their age. So we decided that we wanted to do a robust study and find out what older Coloradans were actually experiencing. So what I'm going to share now are some key findings. I will also direct you to our website, changingthenarrativeco.org. And the reason that I'm doing that is I'm giving you little snippets of a 100-page, very robust report that has a lot of findings that I think might be useful for all of us as we're planning both policy and programs. So the survey was a sample over 1,200 respondents from across Colorado. It covered 60 of Colorado's 64 counties. About 44% of respondents were in their 50s, 43% in their 60s, 11% in their 70s, and the remainder 80 and over. So really kind of across span. There also was a sufficient number of select demographic groups that our researchers were able to draw conclusions with what they call or tell me is statistical significance about how different experiences play out among different demographic groups. So one of our questions was, how has your work status been negatively affected by COVID-19? So you'll see here in this chart that 53% of our overall sample said that they had negatively been affected by COVID-19, and basically 24% had been laid off, about 11% furloughed, 11% had hours reduced, and then some owned businesses and the businesses had to close. You'll see though that and this is true throughout the report, that our lowest income earners in Colorado among our older age group are those that have been most adversely affected throughout. So 69% of Coloradans age 50 and over who had earned less than $25,000 the previous year had their work status negatively affected by COVID. So this then, next slide, is probably absolutely no surprise to anyone. A lot of people pushed out, laid off. So we have a lot of Coloradans age 50 and over looking for work. So overall, 50% of our sample were actively looking for work at the time the survey was conducted. Among those, again, look at the disproportionate impact. Among people who had earned less than $25,000 a year, the previous year, 71% looking for work. The other interesting finding was we also asked people, how many of you are planning to or think you'll have to look for work in the next year? Of the overall sample, 74% of Coloradans age 50 and over thinking that even if they're not currently looking for work, that that's something they're going to have to do in the next year. So we also asked people, like, why are you looking for work? Is this just you want to have a job? And these were kind of the top answers. So for 78% of people who were looking for work, it's basically to sustain daily living. Without work, basically not able to take care of daily needs. For some people, our next highest response was increasing retirement security, recognizing that the closer that we're getting as we're older to retirement age, the more of a setback. We know historically that when older people are laid off, the research shows it takes us much longer to get back in the workforce. So a concern, obviously, about increasing the retirement security of older Coloradans. About 3/4 did say that they were also, and these are not mutually exclusive categories, right? So people could select more than one answer. Work continues to carry a meaning and purpose. And then a group of people, 70% saying they were seeking security against basically uncertainty in the economy. One issue that surfaced was the extreme digital divide. Now, I'm not being flip with this little cat picture. Many of you might have seen the viral cat video that went around yesterday of Zoom calls with cat videos, and that often happens to me here. But we have serious digital divide issues in Colorado. So of those who were working, not the 50% who had been pushed out and had been negatively affected, but of those working, 57% of older Coloradans were not allowed to work remotely. Of our entire sample, 13% did not have technology for remote work, and that dramatically increases for certain groups. So in rural areas, it was 25% don't have technology for remote work. In mountain areas, it was 27%, and it was also a much higher percentage among workers who earned less than 25,000 the previous year. So we have certainly some digital divide issues. We also ask people, what do you need? So, we'd like to think of them as opportunities. And one of the goals of our survey was to inform, the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, the governor's office, all of you as policy influencers, workforce development centers, what are the things that older Coloradans say that they need? So what was really of interest to us was that 50% of those who are looking for work said that they were interested potentially in changing careers and industries. And 39% said they weren't sure, but they were open to the idea. So we know that there's an opportunity here for retraining and reskilling that we need to think about. We listed a lot of type of career support services, and here were the things that had the most interest. People who are looking for work are obviously interested in job posting, hiring events, in networking opportunity, very strong interest in paid certification to get basically reskilled to do something new. People interested in the more traditional forms of assistance offered, like resume assistance, career assessment and counseling, and job coaching. One of the things that was really interesting was the really high degree of desire for training in new things. And we think this is important because there's often the stereotype out there, not only among employers, but often people who are in charge of providing training and reskilling and upskilling, that older people aren't interested in learning new things. And I think our survey found that that was clearly not the case. So overall, 55% of older Coloradans interested in paid certification, but that jumps dramatically among Black Coloradans. 72% said that they were interested in paid certifications. High interest, 44% in receiving training in technology, but higher still among people making between $25,000 and $50,000 a year, and people making under $25,000 a year. 38% of people said that they were interested in training, in kind of developing consulting and whatever, but much higher among Latinos, who 55% of that demographic group said interested in training in consulting, and among African American, 49%. Strong interest overall in internships, apprenticeships, again, ways to learn new industries, new skills, change careers. This was especially high at 52% among Black respondents, and at 44% with respondents in that lowest income group, those who had earned less than $25,000 a year the previous year. Strong interest in entrepreneurship training at 35% overall, but among Black population, Latino population, over half interested in entrepreneurship training. And then finally, people said we need access to technology if we're going to learn new things, if we're going to be able to kind of get reskilled and get back to work. Strong interest and need for access to technology, strongest among Black respondents at over 54%, and among population earning less than $25,000 the previous year at 45%. So I want to go back to where we started talking about age discrimination in the workplace. And so we asked people, have you experienced age discrimination in the workplace? 32% said definitely yes, and 40% said they were not sure. But I want to read some of the answers that people gave, because we allowed people to basically describe some of our experiences, which kind of gives some insight into, if we want to change public policy, what we need to do. One person said, on a phone screen, they asked a question about when I graduated college. When I gave them the date, they hung up on me. Twice, I've been riffed, so reduction in force, with groups consisting solely of people over the age of 50. My gray hair has led to comments at my workplace of how soon will I retire, that I am too old to learn and I should not try for advancement. When my previous employer refused to allow me to work from home during the pandemic, I wondered if it was because I was the oldest worker in the office. I was called a dinosaur. by our newest employee. So those are just a range. I mean, we collected over 300 comments from people who said they either had experienced a workplace discrimination or were not sure, but sharing kind of their stories of what that looked like. So policy recommendations that for us emerged from this report, and we need to invest workforce development dollars. We know that somehow as part of the new administration's Build Back Better, there will be workforce development dollars that will come to states. And we need to make sure in Colorado that we are investing part of those workforce dollars in training and upskilling older workers and not making prejudicial assumptions that older people won't learn new things or are not deserving of workforce investment. We need to address the digital divide issues across the state and provide technology training to anyone of any age who wants it. We need to remove age identifiers like high school graduation dates from job applications. I want to encourage all of you on this call to think about what useful purpose is there for asking for someone's high school graduation date. We know that it is illegal to ask someone their age, but it is not illegal to ask someone their high school graduation date. So we need to remove that. And finally, as you will hear from our coalition partner, Andrea Kuik from the Bell, we need to strengthen our age discrimination laws in Colorado. We can do better. We talk in Colorado about how we are a state for everyone. We want equity, and we need to make sure that we have age equity as well. And Jody, I may have gone over time, but if I haven't, I'm happy to take a few questions.
You have not. You actually have a few minutes left. So thank you very much.
I'm shocked.
I know. You did great. Are there any questions for Janine? And you can unmute yourself to ask the question, or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat room, I'm happy to read it for you. Any questions for Janine? All right, well, give it some thought, because I'm sure that we're going to share additional information that'll spur some questions for you down the road, and all of our panelists are going to be available for a Q&A dialogue, certainly at the end of the presentation as well. I've seen that presentation, a few different versions of it, varieties, having worked with Janine over this last year, and it's always so eye-opening to see those statistics. Every time I see it, I just can't believe it. However, there's tremendous opportunity in those slides as well. And it is important that we get our older Coloradans either into the workforce or back into the workforce, depending on where they are, certainly in their career trajectory. So Janine did talk about, at the end of her slides, policies that we can change, update, or introduce to help the age discrimination here in Colorado. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Andrea Kuik, who is a policy analyst with Bell Policy and another wonderful colleague to share with you the work that they're doing. Andrea?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jody. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to, both be talking with all of you. But I think that this is such an important topic to cover. So again, I'm so excited to be here and be sharing some thoughts with you. Just as a brief introduction about me, again, my name is Andrea Kuik. I'm a policy analyst with the Bell Policy Center. For those of you who don't know much about our organization, we are a policy advocacy research organization here in Colorado. So we focus on Colorado-specific policies. And we have been around now for 20 years. We actually just celebrated our 20th year anniversary a few months ago, which was pretty exciting. But we work on kind of a number of different issues, but they're all within the frame and the umbrella of ensuring that Coloradans have access to the tools and resources they need to ensure economic mobility and economic security for all Coloradans. So we work on that in a few separate ways. They're all very interrelated. So we do a lot of of course, the data analysis and the research to make sure that we're identifying trends, we're looking at the needs of our state and really looking at those policy options to really make sure they're data driven. So as you would imagine, a policy organization does a lot of that work. But we're also working with a number of amazing partners across the state to really look at and then to move forward with taking this information and then implementing it in Colorado. So we're working at the state legislature, both with a number of coalition partners, which I'll talk about here in just a second, to really, again, work at the state capitol to implement these and to pass bills. We're working on ballot initiatives and ballot measures to, across the state. And then we're also working with those in state departments to really look at the rules, the regulatory, the budget process, to really make sure we have a holistic way of implementing policies. So that's a little bit about our organization and what we do. As far as, our work around, our changing demographics, this is something that we've been looking at for several years, because we know, as Janine has mentioned, just a little bit ago, as our policies and as our demographics in Colorado shift, we have to make sure that our policies are in place, both to make sure that we're supporting folks, but also to make sure that as a state, we're taking advantage of all of the things that come with an aging population. So again, we've been looking into some of these policy changes and policy issues for the past several years. And there are a couple of things that we're really excited to talk about. And I'll talk about a couple of them here in just a second. And I'll kind of break it down into some of the things that are happening this legislative session, and that's where I'll spend the vast majority of the time. But then also just conclude with a few additional things to be thinking about as we move into the future. And so before kind of diving into each of those, I want to say in talking about all of this, and as Janine had mentioned, there are a couple of exciting things that are happening along the age discrimination front this coming session. But all of this is being done in collaboration with, a number of partners. So there are a number of organizations that we're all working collectively together to advance these policy solutions. So it's a collaborative of us at the Bell, of course, all the great work that Janine does with changing the narrative, the amazing work that Colorado Senior Lobby does, as you'll hear from Mike Kohler up in Larimer County, and all of the great work with the Workforce Development Center up there, the Gerontological Society, Jody and the Multidisciplinary Center on Aging, as well as the Age-Friendly Workforce Initiative. So again, it's a collection of agencies that are working on this. And I just really want to say that, I think that we have such a strong community to start really and continue to advance these policies. So again, the first thing that I want to start off, and this is something that I think is incredibly exciting, because as Janine has really just noted, and as we've heard kind of across the board, there is very much a need to strengthen our age discrimination laws in Colorado. And so very excited to say that as part of an upcoming bill this session, where there is going to be a measure in there that is going to strengthen our age discrimination laws if passed, which again, I think is incredibly exciting. So it will be part of a larger bill. And so it's part of this larger effort to reform CADA. And so for those who don't know what CADA is, CADA is Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act. And so it's kind of that larger umbrella of protections. Whenever you think of the protections that exist for people based upon age or upon gender, upon race, ethnicity, that's kind of all within the umbrella of CADA. And over the past several years, we've seen CADA, have these updates and all of these different things. So this year, again, this age discrimination piece is going to be within a larger bill that's modernizing some of those CADA protections. As we dig down into it, what this piece of the legislation, if passed, is going to do, it's going to say that if you are bringing an age discrimination case, you have the same rights and protections as anyone else who is bringing forward a case, whether it's based on gender, whether it's based on race or ethnicity, any of those other protected classes. It's essentially saying you now have the same protections as everyone else. And that's really important because in Colorado, that's not currently the case. And it's different in a couple of different ways, which I'll talk about here in a second. But as we look at CADA and we look at these protections, this is really important because what it will do is kind of in two separate ways. it will change some of the protections for people. The first thing that I want to mention is that, in making this equal for everyone, the first thing that it'll do is that it'll say, if you are bringing forward an age discrimination case, you can get the same damages and the same kind of, remuneration as anyone else who's bringing forward a case. So right now, if you're bringing forward an age discrimination case, you can only get a certain type of damages, and they're pretty low, right? And so that has a couple of big implications across the board. One, of course, for people who are bringing forward these cases, oftentimes, if you've been discriminated against based upon age, you're seeing that you have less money coming in. So there's that financial implication for families. The other piece around that, though, that I think is often really important and that we've heard from a number of, people in the field, is that because these dollar limits are so low, you'll see that lawyers and others are saying, I can't take this case because I don't have the, it's not something that whenever I take this case, even if we win, I haven't been able to kind of make enough money back. And so as a result of that, because we see that happening, I think that that's a reason why we don't hear or we don't talk about age discrimination cases. Because they're not in focus as in all of these other things. So by bringing your ability to get certain compensation back, it's a way in which we can then kind of lift and really highlight some of the need for some of these things moving forward. The other thing that I want to say is that by making age discrimination equal with all of these other protected classes, the other thing that this will especially do is that right now for age discrimination cases, there's a higher bar. So if you want to bring an age discrimination case, it's a little bit different than again for gender, for race, ethnicity. The bar is higher to bring forward those cases. And so with making it now equal to all of these other protected classes, that then what this is going to be saying is that it's a bit easier, it's a bit less complicated for people to bring forward these cases. So those are all really important things for people as we move forward and really helping to address some of the discrimination we're seeing in the workforce. I want to say, I want to highlight two important things that I think as we think about this moving forward, and I think about why this is such a big deal. The first thing, the members of the collaborative that I've been talking about, whenever, we were all collectively thinking about trying to get this as part of a bill, we went to a number of state and national experts and we said, here are some of the things we're seeing, here are some of the things that we're thinking about, we're seeing these problems, here are some of our potential solutions that we're thinking about. What do you think about this? And the reaction across the board from each of these different folks, and even from folks who don't even specialize in age discrimination, their response across the board was saying, absolutely, these changes are 100% necessary, because without making sure that age discrimination is equal to all of these other protected classes, it allows employers who are bad actors to continue this. And so, we heard again resoundingly that this was something that was very needed. So I want to highlight that. The second thing that I want to mention is, especially, we've been looking at, what other states have been doing around age discrimination, because we know that this is a Colorado problem, but it's also a national problem as well. And we're starting to see other states, look into what they can do around age discrimination, and they've taken some initial steps, which I think is really wonderful. But I think if we move forward with a lot of this here in Colorado, I think that also sets a national precedent. A lot of the states, they're looking to one another and they're saying, what are you doing? Or, what are you doing? And then they're kind of looking and they get their ideas from one another. So I think that as we also, very much change needed in Colorado, of course, but as we look at, again, also the national conversation, I think that this is something important that we can be thinking about and being a leader in. So that's kind of the nuts and the bolts of the bill and kind of what's involved in it. And, as far as, as we look at it, this again, moving forward, again, this will be part of a larger bill around CADA. The folks who are going to be bringing this forward, the legislators, are a couple of very seasoned experts in all of this, and Senator Winter, Senator Pedersen, and representative lawn team. So again, you'll be seeing that this coming session, and we're really excited about it. I also just want to conclude, I talked a bit about age discrimination here, but the thing that I just want to conclude with as well is that, the changes around age discrimination are very necessary and very needed. But there are also a number of other ways that, the collaborative that I've been mentioning that we're also starting to think about and starting to work toward changing public policy for older workers in general. The one that I'll mention is that, collection of us, organizations, and I can put it in the chat box in a little bit, have been, circulating a letter to try and ask the departments of Colorado Department of Labor and Employment to spend additional, whenever they get some of that additional state and federal stimulus dollars for workforce development, that they use part of that money and designated it specifically for older workers. Because like Janine mentioned, I mean, that is so essential. The other thing that I just kind of want to plant for people as well is that as we think about these policy solutions moving long term, some of this is also just talking to legislators and others and to say like, hey, have you thought about how, our demographics are changing and we need to change our workforce supports. So for example, as we think about the earned income tax credit, for those who don't know, it's a tax credit that benefits low income to moderate income working Coloradans. And it's been an effective measure across the board in, raising people out of poverty. But currently, at both the state and the national level, that tax credit ends for people once they reach the age of 64. So even if you still need it, it ends. You don't get it anymore. But that was created through policy because people didn't think at the time that people would want to work longer. But just as that was changed through policy and created through policy, we can also change that through state policy. So I would just, as we move forward, I think things like that, other tax credits, I think are so important to continue thinking in the policy realm. So, I'll just conclude again, just by, thanking everyone, for your time, and again, really excited to be here. And then just by also saying, I know at the end, we're going to be talking about kind of that call to action. But I just want to stress, as someone who works in the policy realm and works in, kind of the numbers and the data, and I absolutely love data. I 100% love digging into this, and it is one of my favorite things to do. However, I also, on a regular basis, I see lawmakers who are, they get so much data all the time that I sometimes see their eyes glaze over whenever I start giving them the facts and the figures and all this stuff. So, again, I know that we're going to be talking about this call to action at the very end, but I just want to stress how important that is, and all the work that Colorado Senior Lobby and Changing the Narrative and then others do, and really helping to bring forward these stories. So we just reiterate, again, I know we'll be talking about this later, that, even though we have these facts and these figures, it's really making sure that lawmakers and others can put a face to these policies and say why this matters. And I have seen any number of times where lawmakers, they didn't think that this was very important until they had a constituent come to them and say, hey, this is why this matters. So again, I know we'll have this call to action, but would just encourage folks that if you feel comfortable doing so and are at all hesitant and wondering if this matters, I can say that it absolutely 100% does. So again, thank you so much, and I'll hand it back over to Jody.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was terrific, sharing with us a little bit of what is in the pipeline for this year. But I think more importantly, you really stressed how easy it is to get involved and how much we need the voices of certainly the citizens of Colorado and especially older adults. It's funny, but our legislators don't necessarily know what they don't know. And what you said at the end, that many of them don't know that this is an important issue. And so us being kind of loud about that really helps push some of these forward. And over this last year, I've had the privilege of working with Andrea on some of these policy changes, and it's been very eye-opening as well as rewarding. And it is fairly easy. I mean, there's nothing too difficult about it. It's just a matter of getting us all together to be a much louder voice. So thank you, Andrea, so much for sharing what's in the pipeline. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end about how we can all get involved. I'd like to now have two speakers come forward, two panelists who we're honored to have because they feel comfortable enough to share their experiences around age discrimination. And we all realize that that is not easy. Quite often, we don't even know this is happening because people aren't talking about it. So to have these two individuals who are willing to share their experience with us, thank you very much on behalf of all of us, certainly putting on Older Coloradans Week. Our first speaker is Mike Kohler, who is the training coordinator at Elevate Training of Larimer County Workforce and Economic Development. And we'll have Mike speak for a few minutes and share his experience. And then we'll have our second speaker, whom I'll introduce once Mike finishes. And then they'll be involved certainly in our discussion at the end of this program to share with you some additional experiences. And I'd also like to say that we have a few comments in the chat room of people who have also experienced age discrimination. So thank you very much for coming forward on that. So with that, Mike, do you mind sharing your experience with us?
Thanks very much, Jody. And as Jody mentioned, I'm responsible for a training program. It's a leadership and management training program that is an extension of Larimer County's Economic Development Department. So I work with businesses throughout Northern Colorado to help improve their leadership teams. In addition to that full-time job for Larimer County as my day job, I teach in 2 grad programs for Purdue University and West Virginia University in strategic communications. So I missed the retirement memo. Hey, what can I say? A little bit of an overachiever, perhaps. I'll try not to be an over talker, but when I heard that we had 3 to 5 minutes to share our story, I'm kind of the 5-minute type. So I'll try and make it as concise as I can, although I did notice we're at least a full minute, possibly 2 ahead of schedule. Wow, incredible. My story begins in the Kansas City metro market, where my wife and I moved from 6 years ago. And in that market, I worked for, I was hired by a large global engineering company to run the communications department of one of the 5 P&L divisions. And after taking that job, I discovered why the corporate people had hired me, because they saw that I had the skills to do a SWOT analysis, and frankly, my job ended up being working myself out of a job. That is, I saw how duplicative and wasteful the department was that I was running, because it was a duplication of corporate services. So I shut it down, and they kept me on board. Maybe they were afraid that, gee, that older guy might sue them. But I remember that fateful day when it was cardboard box day, when my time was up. They gave me a nice commendation letter and a bonus check and my going away. So off I went. I became something in my late 50s that I'd never been before. Dispensable. And so they gave me a little severance package that included one of those standard outplacement services. And so I did what I thought was the right thing to do. I spiffed up my resume and bragged up my tremendous professional history, which included executive level service for decades, right? And I thought that was the right thing to do. I could not even get interviewed, okay? Because some of the evidence on that resume, unbeknownst to me at the time, was a dead giveaway that, I might be a little on the older side. And so assumptions were kicking in. I can't validate it. I could feel it though, that, oh, he'll want too much money, or gee, he wouldn't take this job. It would be below what he used to be, and all that kind of nonsense. The final straw was when a city manager for one of the cities in the Kansas City metro area heard my guerrilla self-marketing pitch that, look, I'll do this posted job for a communications professional, that I would do it. You can hire me on a pilot program, and I'll do it on a contract basis. And when he was very interested, ready to pull the trigger. But then when he told me after a couple of interviews that HR just won't let me, that was it. And time to come to Colorado, where a wonderful thing happened as happenstance. When I moved here, I basically ruled out traditional employment and began networking, because I figured, I was 60 plus then, that traditional employment just wasn't going to happen. So I started doing my networking thing that came naturally to me. And I filled out an RFP and was chosen as a speaker for an annual symposium that, ironically, I'm now in charge of. And when the person who chose me wanted to network, sit down, have coffee, maybe just to validate the choice of me as a speaker, I was bragging up my business history and such. And he saw something different. He recognized the competencies that I was bringing to the table. And out of the blue, he said, Mike, we're trying to start up this management leadership training program. You think this is something you'd be interested in? I was like stunned because I'd never been in government. I'd never been in training development or HR or anything like that. But the light bulb came on right away. And so, boom, based on the competencies that he figured I had, brought me on board. I created, branded the program, and it's going great guns. So there we go. That's the great news. A success story, right? Not right. Not right. Because I think I benefited from dumb luck. And I'm not going to do an assault on the entire HR category, but HR, and I'm in their club now. I'm in the Northern Colorado chapter of the HR Association. And I'm a little bit of the pariah in the group, but I see that especially with COVID in the past year, exacerbating the problem, that there's a default in employment practices to, well, the same old way we've always done things, which is, which includes things like screening out, the efficiency applicant tracking systems, screening people out instead of bringing the right people into the applicant funnel. And so it's ironic that the program I'm in charge of is education to HR people and hiring managers about improving their employment practices. And as I do focus groups with some of these employers, I get into fights with them, not bare knuckles fist fights, but arguments, because they'll say things, the standard assumptions that, oh, well, old people will want too much money, or they don't have tech savvy, or they're set in their ways, all that kind of stuff. And I have to tell you, I'm sad to report that because I work with so many businesses, I see that it's still pervasive. Despite our best efforts in the program that I run, we're just scratching the surface, and that there is implicit bias out there, and that we all need to do everything we can to fight that. Here's one example, and then I'll finish. In my department, because, gee, they do pay attention to me a little bit, and several employees or employers that we've trained on this, we do redacted applicant reviews, where an objective third party in our department gets all the applications, the resumes and such, and using the good old fashioned technology called Sharpie, redacts out all of the identifiers, including age, but also location, gender, etc. And the results have been great. And so I hope we can promote that kind of employment practice to the influencers of policy. So thank you to Andrea for that. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Yay, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing that. Your story is always so interesting because you've been on both sides of the coin. You've experienced age discrimination, yet then found an employer who values the work of older adults and also created your own opportunity. So there's a few messages in your story there that I hope will resonate with our attendees today. And don't forget to add your questions to the chat room, or if there was something about Mike's story and soon to be Diksha's story that resonates with you, please share with others in that space, and then we can address and have a dialogue with those questions toward the end. So with that, I'd like to introduce Diksha Nagar, actually Dr. Diksha Nagar, who is our next panelist. And Diksha is an independent scholar, activist. She's currently working with Denver Public Libraries around their immigrant and refugee programs. She's a board member of many local nonprofits. She manages some charitable trusts in India. So besides all that, she's joined us today to share her story about being under and over employed in a variety of situations. So thank you for being here, Diksha. Take it away.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your interest in my story. So my story is about a dreamer, a young, bright student who came to this country from a working class family on a full scholarship to pursue her PhD. My story is also about a short, brown-skinned woman from a third world country who has always been engaged in a variety of creative projects, but has been unemployed and underemployed for most part of her life. Someone who has not succeeded in getting a professional job in Colorado, despite her extensive work with international organizations like UNICEF and serving as the director of the education department of the Mathers Museum of World Cultures at Indiana University. So in the 4 minutes I have, I briefly want to share some of my insights and experiences. So number one, in my experience, ageism is present at every age. Part of my struggle has been, I have never been the right age. When I was young, I was too young, so people hired me as an intern, consultant, volunteer, report writer, so that I could produce high quality work for low pay or no pay. During my 40s, I was overqualified for most positions because of my PhD. I was asked to underplay my experiences and ideas because I did not want to threaten or intimidate prospective supervisors with my potential and abilities and ideas. And now in my 50s, I'm told to look into serving on boards because of my vast experiences. My question is why so many people in the workforce are never the right age. The second point that I want to bring it up is that ageism does not stand alone in itself. It always stands in combination with who you are and where you come from. Gender, height, personality, they all matter. If you are an immigrant or a refugee, especially a woman, then where you come from and what language you speak also matters. Immigration is government regulated. So if you are a minority of a minority, it does not make life simple. And in Colorado, I do represent minority of the minorities, linguistically, ethnically, in many ways. So it's simply, if you are a minority of a minority, it simply stands on where you are on the preferred list of the employers. The language, your skin color, your ethnicity, everything is and has to be fed into that statistics. It does not matter how open, willing, and qualified you are in terms of problem solving. In my work with various immigrant and refugee populations, I've found that in terms of providing the services, it's the intentionality and the cultural perspective that you have that matters in providing high quality services. It is my disciplinary training that has also mattered. So my background in folklore and anthropology has helped me enormously in helping people from various countries, even though I don't speak any of their languages. But when it comes to job with immigrant and refugee services, I do not qualify because I don't speak their language. So again, my options are further limited. I've also noticed that there is a question of, great cultural stereotyping. Whenever immigrants are usually clumped, there is a whole stereotypical notion that goes with, who they are or what they should be representing. So in my experiences, I have noticed that whenever I have said anything meaningful, people who have no idea of the struggles and challenges and how I represent and come from a very, very working class family, they have just assumed that I have come from a very privileged background and I do not fit in the mold. So they say that, you are not a typical immigrant, you are educated, you have a PhD. And so when now that I'm in my 50s and I've been working with the community and still struggling to find a full-time employment, I have met with a lot of people from immigrant and refugee community who are highly qualified and they are older adults, but they are serving in the menial position. There is no survey that gives you a statistics of how many well-qualified immigrant older adults are here in Colorado or in the United States that are serving in low pay or no pay or positions. So they're we don't have the numbers just because they don't speak English. So I think that ageism is a mindset that pervades and impacts not only the life of applicants, but also impacts the workforce by denying highly qualified and competent people to serve in an effective manner. And I just want to give you a glimpse of some of the advice I have received in recent months by the consultants whenever I have, with my current job search. It has been I have some interesting glimpse of that. So when I am getting my applications reviewed, some people say that, some professional consultants, they say that drop that PhD, it intimidates the employers. Others say that keep it, but mention it at the very bottom of the page. The second piece of advice I have received throughout my life, but even now, that change your name to D or something familiar on the resume just for the interview purposes. Once you are in, then you can tell them who you are. But at least with that name, they will get an idea of your gender. Your name does not tell you who you are, and sometimes people are looking for a man or a woman to serve in a particular position. I've also received recommendation that I wear native clothing when I meet people or when I'm networking, and especially at the interviews. I've also been told that on one hand, I should not be touting about my experiences and qualifications and my ideas, but also I should not come across as too motherly. And lastly, more recently, people have said that these consultants have said that you might benefit for all these programs that are being promoted through City and County of Denver and Colorado about older adults, but you may try to do something about looking your age. So all this talk about the policy of filing for age, of age discrimination in the job force, and they are really important. But my biggest question is that how do older adults address the issue of ageism as they share the stories about discrimination without feeling that they are complaining or whining and are being patronized? Because definitely, if you don't get a job, then people look at you as a failed person, somebody who has been unsuccessful. So at that note, I'm going to end my story. Thank you.
Diksha, thank you so much for that shocking feedback that you've received. And thank you for being willing to share that with us. It does prove that we have a lot of work to do, certainly. And for you to be open like that certainly helps us and motivates us to do even more. So thank you so much for sharing your story and being with us today. We have a few questions in the chat room. So Mike, Diksha, Andrea, and Janine, if you can be available to answer some of these, and feel free to jump in. And then what we'll do is we'll spend a few minutes then talking about call to action. So there's some questions about just the hiring process itself and how age discrimination kind of manifests in that. But it's so hard to prove when the employer says, oh, but we found a more qualified candidate. What can people do to work around that? Is there feedback that they can have with the hiring manager to ask certain questions? I mean, what strategies, certainly Mike and Diksha, maybe through your experiences of applying for jobs, and Janine, what you've heard from the public, is there anything that people can do when they're told we found a more qualified candidate when they know that age discrimination probably took place?
Well, I'll concede to somebody with more of a happy face response, but I will tell you that in deference to the HR category, they're pretty limited on what they can say, because especially the larger ones that might have a risk management department that would tell them, don't be saying anything that's going to get us in a fix later. But I got to tell you, the best feedback I ever got, I appreciated it so much. Before I left Kansas City, there was a young woman who I was one of 2 finalists, and someone closer to her age and maybe cultural norms and so forth was the choice. And she told me so. That hiring manager told me so, that, man, Mike, it was so close, but here's what I went with. So, man, honesty, it'd be great if they could be more honest, but legally, they kind of skate on thin ice.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. Anyone else have any insight?
So I would just say, I don't have insight into, because I think Mike's exactly right, but that to me is why it's so important for us to act collectively and support the kind of strengthened age discrimination and the strengthening the overall Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act to include age discrimination. One of the problems now with the federal age discrimination law is a series of court decisions have said, first, in a lot of areas, it does not apply to the hiring process. We also know, because of Supreme Court decisions, that the burden of proof is much higher to prove age discrimination than others. So, I think that there are individual strategies, but to me, what's inherently wrong with this whole system, and why I think what this coalition is doing is so important, is we need to get to the root. We need, the American Society on Aging published a series of studies that showed in states that have stronger age discrimination laws, like the ones that Andrea is talking about, guess what? They have less age discrimination. Like, it's real. So, I know the pressure of trying to figure it out for ourselves, but to me, collectively, the best thing that we can do for all older Coloradans is go ahead and support stronger anti-discrimination laws.
Terrific. Thank you.
And I'm just gonna, I guess,
yeah, Andrea,
piggyback on a little bit to what Janine had mentioned. And I think that, there's such a good point that I think, Mike's story, I think really highlights, is that kind of the collective ability to address some of these things needs to come from both angles. We absolutely need these stronger age discrimination laws and age discrimination statutes, and the things that we're talking about, here today, and collaboratively, that everyone's working on with strengthening our age discrimination statutes. That's one step, and that's one thing. But whether it is in the coming years coming back and then saying what, ban the box on asking people for high school or college graduation dates. Like, this is a large movement of saying, here's one step, next year we come back and we do something more, because this is a problem that's not going away. While at the same time, I think, like Mike has really been talking about, also really having, and the kind of the narrative change about how we do all of this and working with employers to show some of this, but it has to be a collaborative long-term effort to really making this a reality.
Right. And Andrea, let me just piggyback on that. I mean, the other thing that changing the narrative is doing is literally we go everywhere, or at least we did before the pandemic, and we make the business case for older workers and refute a lot of the stereotypes about older workers. And actually before the pandemic, we were getting, Karen Brown led that effort. We were making presentations everywhere. 87% of employers who participated in one of our presentations said they were more likely to hire older workers. So we need to continue on the narrative change. And I also believe we need to strengthen age discrimination laws.
If I may say
Of course, please, Diksha.
I also am a strong advocate of trainings to the HR, because they do not understand. Everything that is, they are getting tons of applications and they just go by their, keyword and whatever program they use to shortlist candidates for interviews. The recruiting process has become so standardized and so automated, so to speak, that human element is completely missing. And the right keywords, that is one thing that people keep on emphasizing on resume writing and resume building and things like that. So we have to kind of humanize that process by bringing the recruiters, launching training programs for the recruiters, and also like they are having all these cultural inclusivity workshop. It is all ethnicity bound. We need to do something. We have to integrate issues connected with ageism with that. That was one point. And the second thing is that, speaking from immigrant perspective, that people need to be made aware of their rights and privileges, where they should be reaching out. How do you read that? How do you know? Where do you go when you get that, we found a better candidate? And if that better candidate is also from, a different minority community. There are all these issues in terms of how do you know that you are being impacted by ageism when you don't know who else has applied. So I think that there has to be greater education on the topic, and working directly with recruiters as well as the applicants, maybe a new format of training for older adults when they are seeking application, turning in their applications. So.
Thank you, Diksha, for that. And that's a perfect segue into our next question that Gail posed, talking about bringing forward an age discrimination case, but how, and there's this fear that I will be retaliated in the hiring process. So how is that being addressed so that people do come forward more and don't sit in silence just because of the fear? Andrea, do you have any insight through your work on how that's being addressed?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great question. And I think that, again, that really relates to kind of the strong public policies, and then in all of this, making sure that they're right. Like, so there is the piece of this and saying, yes, strengthen how people are able to bring forward these cases. But I think as we look at strong and holistic public policy, we also need to make sure that that enforcement is there. And then I think also to Diksha's point, and that making sure people know their rights. And so within all of this, I mean, yes, passing a law is the first step in all of this. But then it's also, I think, also a matter of kind of constant vigilance to say, do people know their rights? Do people feel that there's fear? And then, of course, across the board, whether it be for age or gender or race or ethnicity or anything, it's always kind of constantly coming back and saying, what are the additional resources we may need as a state and as a public policy solution to make sure that those are in place. And I think also, because I think that I had seen a kind of a comment in the chat about kind of what other states are doing. And again, I think Diksha's point reminded me of some of the other work that we've seen in other places. I mean, New York is a state that's been looking at different ways to strengthen their age discrimination statutes. So that's been one aspect of it. But the other thing that they've also been doing is that they have been working through their, I believe it's New York City, kind of through their, one of their departments there, to do greater outreach to both businesses, I believe, but then also to people throughout the city to say, so here are your rights. If you have questions, you have concerns, all of these different things. I mean, making sure that those policies and making sure that there's that kind of place for people to come if they have concerns. So, the short answer, I think, in all of this to make sure people feel comfortable is kind of, again, that constant vigilance. And then really kind of having that constant, pulse on what's happening, which is, I think, why it's so important. I think, to have people talking to their legislators and, the great work that Janine and others have been doing, especially around, talking to individual Coloradans to see what exactly are your needs so that those policy solutions can really be crafted.
Terrific. Thank you. And that'll lead us into our call to action in just a few minutes. But let's do one more question before we do our call to action segment, and then we'll come back to additional questions after that. So Bob asked, how do we kind of get out of our own way in that we box ourselves into our skill sets and experiences? This is who I am. This is what I've done for 40 years. However, Janine, you have a very interesting stat on your presentation about how open older adults are to changing up skills, retooling. So how do people kind of get out of their own way to make themselves more marketable, certainly in the job market?
So I am going to let Mike maybe talk to that on an individual level, but I do want to say, I mean, one of the myths is that older people don't want to do that. And I think what our survey found pretty definitively was a great openness to changing industries, to learning new things, to reskilling, whatever. So part of one of the things that we can all collectively do is put that message out there and not let the narrative persist that older people don't want to learn new things. And so I think the more that we kind of repeat that, we're going to be sharing this presentation with everyone. And it's just like, yes. But then on the policy side, so one is the narrative piece. Yes, we do want to learn new things as we get older, and we're willing to switch careers and industries. But the other, on the policy piece, it's kind of like that letter to the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. We need to let the governor's office, the Workforce Centers, Department of Labor and Employment know that their community college systems, higher ed, that we've got to be really intentional about programs to upskill and reskill older people, and make sure as money is flowing in the state that some of it is directed specifically at programs that are tailored to older people who are in that category. And we know in Colorado, that's a fairly large percentage.
Yeah. Mike, do you have anything to add to what Janine said about your own personal experience?
Yeah, in Northern Colorado, we have a group called the Age Friendly Workplace Initiative that I'm part of. And I think our chairman is in our group today, that we're trying to help job seekers realize that guerrilla self-marketing tactics, that is, if you're resting on just the online application, you aren't even in the game. That taking a whole new approach to things and busting past little end run around HR to get to people, network in the organizations that you want to target, and tell them not what your history says, but what does the future look like because of the things you know how to do, the skills and competencies you bring to the table that we hear employers complaining about all the time. Oh, these days, people don't have the work ethic, the loyalty, et cetera. These are the things we can leverage.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. So moving on, as we have about a little over 10 minutes left together, just talking more in depth about how everyone on certainly this call who are interested in getting involved can do that. Back in November, Bell Policy hosted with a number of other organizations a workforce summit around age discrimination, and did a large call to action at the end, of which almost 100 individuals registered. And it was an education about what can be done as an individual to help move this cause. And it's interesting, just in the chat room, I see Greg has asked a question that could tie into just how we build this advocacy, that folks who do earn less than $25,000 per year don't necessarily know what they can do and know the laws, and even those that earn over 25,000 don't necessarily know what they can do. So can we talk a little bit through maybe Janine, the Action Network, and the work that we can do to combine these efforts with what happened in November with today's call?
You bet.
So Andrea and Janine, do you want to address that?
You bet. So I'm going to, right now, I am pasting a link into the chat, and I'd invite everybody to basically open that link, which is to a form, and I'm going to share a screen. So you'll see there's a link that basically is a bit.ly link that says, get involved, age discrimination. I am now going to share a screen. So you'll see what some of the options are. Okay, I am hoping I'm sharing the right screen. Okay, do we see a form that says Action Network at the top?
Yes.
Yay. All right. So what you've got on the right-hand side, this is the link to the form. Basically, if you would, put in your email address so we can follow up with you, and your zip code so we have a sense of geographic areas. So for example, if we want to talk to legislators around the state that about the bill that Andrea talked about earlier, and you've got a connection with your legislature, we want to make sure that we can let you know, here's where you can go. Here are some of the ways that you can get involved. So you could stay engaged just through the email list. If you want to testify before the legislature, some of you might have been in the Monday session that Colorado Senior Lobby and partners put on about virtual advocacy. You might call your own representative. We are looking for people to write letters to the editor or op-ed pieces around the state on this particular issue. And if you signed up for that, we would be in touch. We'll do a little mini course on writing an op-ed piece, give you some templates and set you off. Anyone who's willing to share your own story with media and reporters, Bell Policy Center and a colleague of Andrea's named Hunter has been kind of collecting stories, because we know that we do want some media around this. You could share your story if you don't want to talk to a reporter, but you're okay with us just telling about you, maybe with your name not attached. You could simply share your story in a story bank. This is really about community education and organizing. So if you're willing, and again, we would provide toolkits, samples, if you're willing to just organize a small virtual event with friends. I literally just got an email from someone who was on this call earlier who said, would I come out and talk to their Rotary on the same topic? You bet I will. So, we can do virtual events to kind of spread the word, let people know. If you have other ideas, go back up to this box. Other ways I would like to get involved, just go ahead and put your ideas, and then you click on the I'm in button, and we'll be in touch with you. So basically, I don't know, Andrea, if you'd like to add anything, but the idea, we're trying to find out, changing the narrative. What we talk about is we want to educate, and hopefully being part of a presentation like this today fulfills that purpose. We want to activate, because we can know things, but if we don't choose to take action and do something, there's not a lot of point. And we want to advocate for better policies for older Coloradans. So I hope you will join me and everybody else on this call in getting involved in this really important issue. And even if right now you can't decide exactly what you want to do, you can just click Stay Engaged through our mailing list. Okay. And the link is in the chat. So you just click through that link and you'll pop up to something like this, and you can fill it out in real time. Andrea, do you?
Yeah, I would just, echo what Janine had been talking about from before, and that, and as I'm sure, everyone has been hearing, who's been, joining Colorado Senior Lobby's events all throughout the week, just how important this stuff is. That again, I think that, from all the comments in the chat box and everything else, that this stuff is so important, but we often just don't talk about it. And it's, the legislators and others, oftentimes it's the changes that they're not keeping the status quo because, they're bad people or anything else. Oftentimes they just don't know. They don't hear about it from their constituents. They haven't seen it, and they don't connect how all of this is impacting the people in their district and impacting the people in their lives. So the personal stories, again, I would just, whether it's an op-ed or whether it's a call to their representative, those are so incredibly meaningful. And again, I can't tell you how many times I have seen it. I have seen it kind of like click on for a representative or a senator, where they're like, I didn't see why this was an issue before. But then they hear the story and then they say, oh, I get it now. I understand why this matters. It helps connect them, and so I would just, mention that if this is something that people feel, comfortable with, that again, this is just so important, not only for our legislators, but then also for some of this. It also just helps, our, the other people in our community know that this is, again, this is an issue that they can connect with, and that this is something that's really important for Coloradans throughout our state. So it just echo that again, that this is just so important for helping to move these public policies.
Thank you so much, Janine and Andrea. Are there any questions specifically about this that Janine has just presented? Anything that's confusing? The link is in the chat room. I'm seeing it come up here. So click on that and fill out that information. Are there any additional questions for any of the panelists as we wrap up our time together today?
May I add something?
Of course,
again,
Diksha, please.
Marcia just mentioned about the stories, and the story bank was also listed on Janine's website. Personal stories are really hard to articulate. And one of the best questions I got from Bell Policy Center when I talked to Hunter, one of their analysts, was about the psychological pressures of what kind. How do you feel, being an older adult? So what I want to say is that a lot of times people feel that they are whining, they are complaining, the way when they're sharing their story. It is one of the hardest things. There is like sympathy, or, we need more understanding, not sympathy or empathy. And that is, so in terms of advocacy, in terms of building the climate for understanding, for trainings, the stories, we have to change the perspective on stories, because job in this current society equates to success. It is like a scale of not your abilities or potential, but how you're able to tout and pitch and sell your thing. And that is all very, very cultural centered to American society, or the corporate society, corporate global society that we are living in. So we have to create that perspective on hearing the stories of people who are struggling and have, that stereotypes that goes with not getting a job and being older. We have to address that somehow and create more awareness about how the stories are presented, shared, and contextualized.
Mm-hmm. And that is so true, Diksha. We can't do this work without understanding what's truly happening in the trenches. So sharing those stories is imperative for this to move forward. Are there any additional questions for any of our panelists? Now is the time. If you'd like to unmute yourself, or if you're a little more comfortable typing it into the chat room, if you can do that. Marcia, yes.
I put a note in the chat. But the thing about stories is that they're anecdotes. It's anecdotal evidence. And it is what drives policy in America at all levels. If some legislator or city council person or whomever is in a policy-making position knows someone who has heard a particularly heart-wrenching story, shall I say, about somebody's experience, they're going to do something about it. Whether that's right or wrong, because data doesn't always support what people believe and what they hear in anecdotal situations, nonetheless, telling your story is what drives policy. That's the way it works in this country at all levels. Why did we get an oil and gas commission? Because somebody's house blew up. Not because it was the right thing to do, not because for anybody that's concerned about those things, this is a problem across Colorado, but because somebody's house blew up. That's the example of why we needed changes in those regulations. I mean, I'm frankly very pessimistic about changes in hiring until HR programs and HR executives really learn and experience discrimination for themselves and teach all of their executives for whom they are hiring why it's important to have a diverse workforce, not just because of age. So, but maybe I'm too old to have any optimistic feeling about it. I've experienced it way too many times in my life.
No, Marcia, you're not.
I'm holding out hope. I'm holding out hope. Although there is a joke about the great thing about millennials, they're getting older.
So
and they haven't walked in our shoes.
Yeah.
That is
great thing about all of us, though. We are all getting older. I want to leave everybody with this. Today, for each one of us, is the oldest we've ever been. And think about this before we go to sleep. Tonight is the youngest we'll ever be. If we are fortunate, we're all waking up tomorrow morning one day older, right? So that, Marcia, is what makes me optimistic, that
yes.
The arc of justice bends.
Aging is a gift. So on that note, it's time to wrap up.
We used to say about women's movement that.
Oh, Marcia got muted. So I'm sorry, Marcia, somehow you got muted, but it is 11:30.
Anyway, we used to say aging was a radicalizing experience.
Well, thank you for that. So everyone, there's a few pieces of homework in the chat room. If you don't mind just taking a quick minute before we all log off. We have the sign up to get more involved in this work, which Janine has added the link. So please look for that link in the chat box. We also have the link to the evaluation to today's session. It's very important and imperative that we hear directly from all of you about how you thought the session went, but more importantly, what you'd like to learn in the future so we can build programming around that. So on behalf of certainly Colorado Senior Lobby and all of the organizations involved in Older Coloradans Week, I'd like to give a sincere thank you to all of our panelists, Janine, Mike, Andrea, Diksha, for sharing certainly stories and how to get involved and how together we can eliminate age discrimination. So with that, I'd also like to remind you of this afternoon session, which will wrap up the week, which begins at 1:30. And Bob Brucker, would you like to talk a little bit about that before we log off?
Very quickly, we have Speaker of the House, Garnett, who's going to be speaking to us at 1:30. And then we'll have some time for discussion of some of the things that we've heard this week. So please join us. Thank you.
Thank you. So go have a quick lunch break and we'll see everyone back at 1:30. Have a great rest of the day and thank you for attending.